Chapter 1. The Silence That Arrived Without Announcement. The change did not announce itself. It did not arrive with banners, countdowns, or a single defining moment that could later be marked in documentaries or timelines. Instead, it crept into existence during the hours when the world was least attentive, late at night, when traffic thinned and the road reclaimed a quieter personality. These were the hours when the city exhaled, when highways stretched into long, reflective ribbons, and when the familiar roar of engines softened into a distant, uneven chorus. It was then that something unfamiliar began to pass through the darkness. At first, it felt like an absence rather than a presence. A car moved alongside another without the expected vibration, without the low mechanical growl that had always accompanied motion. Tires whispered across asphalt. Wind traced the contours of metal. And then the vehicle was gone, leaving behind a stillness that lingered just long enough to be noticed. Most people did not register it consciously. They sensed it the way one senses a room becoming quieter without knowing why. The mind adjusted before curiosity could form. For more than a century, noise had been an inseparable part of driving. Engines announced themselves at intersections. Exhaust echoed between buildings. Idling motors filled the pauses between movement. The soundscape of the road was so ingrained that its absence felt unnatural, even unsettling. Yet the silence kept returning. Electric vehicles were not new, despite how modern they seemed. In fact, they predated gasoline cars. At the turn of the 20th century, electric carriages rolled through cities with elegance and ease, while internal combustion engines struggled with reliability and crude mechanics. Electric propulsion was clean, quiet, and simple. Drivers did not need to wrestle hand cranks or tolerate clouds of smoke. For a brief period, electricity appeared to be the future of mobility. But progress does not always favor refinement. It favors scalability. Gasoline was dense, transportable, and increasingly inexpensive. Infrastructure grew around it rapidly. Roads, refineries, pipelines, and filling stations formed a network that electricity could not yet match. Batteries were heavy, fragile, and limited. Electric vehicles faded not because they were inferior, but because they were inconvenient at scale. And so the world made a choice, loud, energetic, and irreversible, or so it seemed. For the next 100 years, the automobile evolved without changing its fundamental nature. Carburetors gave way to fuel injection. Manual transmissions became automatic. Electronics improved efficiency and control. But every improvement layered itself onto the same basic principle: burn fuel, create explosions, convert force into motion. Noise became synonymous with power. Silence, when it appeared, was treated as a deficiency. By the end of the 20th century, the automotive industry was vast, mature, and confident. Entire economies depended on it. Millions of jobs existed to support it. Cultural identities were shaped around it. The idea that cars could be fundamentally different, quieter, simpler, less mechanical, was rarely entertained outside academic circles and small experimental programs. Then quietly, the question returned: why should motion require noise? In 2003, a small company was formed around that question. Tesla Motors did not begin with factories, dealer networks, or generations of engineering heritage. It began with dissatisfaction. The founders, engineers Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, were not attempting to refine the existing system. They wanted to bypass it entirely. Their ambition was not to improve gasoline cars, but to make them irrelevant. The company's name was a signal rather than a brand. Nikola Tesla had been a visionary whose ideas often arrived before the world was ready to understand them. Alternating current, wireless energy transmission, and electromagnetic principles that later defined modern life were once dismissed as impractical curiosities. To name a car company after him was an act of defiance and perhaps a warning. Tesla Motors did not set out to build an electric car for everyone. That would come later. First, it needed to prove that electricity could be desirable. At the time, electric vehicles were associated with compromise. They were small, underpowered, and utilitarian. They existed primarily to satisfy regulations or to signal environmental virtue. They were not aspirational objects. No one dreamed of driving them late at night, windows down, simply for the pleasure of movement. Tesla wanted to change that perception. The company's first product, the Roadster, was a calculated gamble. It was expensive, impractical for daily use, and limited in production. But it was fast, not conventionally fast, with roaring engines and dramatic gear changes, but shockingly immediate. Electric motors delivered torque without delay. Acceleration arrived instantly, silently, without ceremony. For drivers accustomed to internal combustion, the experience was disorienting. There was no buildup, no auditory cue signaling effort. Speed simply appeared. At night, this effect was magnified. Without sound to anchor sensation, the world seemed to slide past the car more smoothly, almost dreamlike. Streetlights blurred. The road stretched ahead, uninterrupted. The Roadster did not sell in large numbers. It was never meant to. Its purpose was psychological. It demonstrated that silence could coexist with excitement, that electricity was not a limitation but a different kind of power. Behind the scenes, Tesla nearly collapsed under the weight of its ambition. Production delays, cost overruns, and technical failures drained resources. In 2008, as the global financial crisis tightened its grip, the company came within weeks of bankruptcy. Survival depended on personal risk, last-minute funding, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. The Roadster saved Tesla not through profit, but through proof. The idea had escaped. Drivers who experienced it spoke not only of speed but of calm, of clarity, of a feeling that driving had become less aggressive, less demanding. This was not something that could be quantified easily, and Tesla did not try. It allowed the sensation to speak for itself. As the Roadster faded from production, Tesla turned its attention to something far more ambitious, a car that could replace the gasoline sedan entirely. Not a curiosity, not a luxury experiment, a real car for real roads. The night roads in particular. Long after rush hour ended, those roads revealed the true character of a vehicle. Without congestion to hide flaws, every vibration, every noise, every hesitation became apparent. Tesla understood that if electric cars were to succeed, they needed to excel in these moments, not merely tolerate them. This understanding shaped everything that followed. The silence that had once seemed unnatural began to feel intentional. It no longer signaled absence, but refinement. Drivers did not miss the engine noise once it was gone. They noticed how much effort it had demanded from them, how much tension it had introduced without permission. Electric motion required less interpretation. It was direct, honest. As Tesla prepared its next step, the world was not yet ready to acknowledge what was happening. Gasoline still dominated. Electric vehicles were still marginal. The roads were still loud. But the silence had arrived. It was waiting. Chapter 2: The Sedan That Taught the Night to Slow Down. When Tesla turned its attention from proving a concept to replacing a category, it chose its target carefully. The luxury sedan was not merely a market segment, it was a cultural artifact. For decades, it had represented arrival, success, and technological maturity. These were the cars executives drove home late at night, gliding through empty streets after long days, insulated from the world by leather, glass, and finely tuned machinery. If electric vehicles were ever going to be taken seriously, they would have to succeed here. The challenge was not simply to match what existed, but to redefine what refinement meant. Traditional luxury had evolved incrementally. Engines became quieter, suspension smoother, cabins more insulated. Engineers worked tirelessly to suppress vibration, to mask noise, to soften the mechanical violence happening beneath the hood. Yet no matter how advanced the car, that violence remained. Pistons still fired, fuel still ignited, motion still began with explosions. Tesla approached the problem from a different direction. Instead of hiding the engine, it removed it. The Model S did not arrive as a tentative experiment. It arrived as a statement, even if the statement was delivered softly. From the outside, the car was elegant but restrained, its lines smooth and unassuming. There was no grille to announce aggression, no unnecessary ornamentation to demand attention. It looked less like a machine and more like an object shaped by airflow and intention. Inside, the departure from convention was unmistakable. The dashboard was almost empty. Buttons were scarce. Controls lived behind a large vertical screen that glowed gently in the dim cabin. The absence of clutter created a sense of space that felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a room where furniture had been carefully removed rather than added. This minimalism was not aesthetic alone. It reflected a deeper philosophy. The Model S was not built around mechanical systems that required constant intervention. It was built around software, sensors, and electric motors that operated quietly and predictably. The driver was not expected to manage complexity. The car absorbed it. At night, this difference became profound. Starting a gasoline car is a small but persistent ritual. An engine wakes, vibrations ripple through the cabin, noise establishes presence. The Model S did none of this. It simply became ready. There was no transition from rest to motion, no audible confirmation that power was available. The car waited patiently, as if it had been awake the entire time. Acceleration followed the same logic. There was no buildup, no delay. Pressing the pedal did not request power, it released it. The car surged forward with a smoothness that felt almost disconnected from effort. Speed arrived without announcement, and just as quietly it stabilized. For drivers accustomed to the language of engines, this required adjustment. Noise had always served as feedback, a reassurance that the car was responding. Without it, motion felt different, less dramatic but more controlled. At night, when visual cues were limited, and the world narrowed to headlight beams and passing lines, this calm became comforting rather than unsettling. The road no longer competed for attention. It invited focus. Tesla paired this physical serenity with a radical rethinking of how cars evolved over time. Traditionally, a vehicle was fixed at the moment it left the factory. Improvements arrived years later, in the next model cycle. The Model S rejected this assumption entirely. Software updates arrived wirelessly, often while the car sat parked overnight. Performance improved. Range increased. Features appeared without warning. Owners woke to better cars than the ones they had gone to sleep in. This mattered in subtle ways. It changed the relationship between driver and machine. The car felt less like an object and more like a system, responsive, attentive, capable of learning. At night, when routines softened and attention drifted inward, this sense of quiet partnership became noticeable. The Model S also forced a reconsideration of distance. Range anxiety had long been the primary objection to electric vehicles, a lingering fear rooted as much in psychology as in practicality. Tesla addressed it not only through larger batteries, but through infrastructure. The supercharger network grew steadily, threading itself along highways and major routes. These stations were different from gas stations in character and tone. They were quieter, less urgent, designed for pauses rather than transactions. Late at night, superchargers became places of stillness. Cars arrived one by one, connected silently, and waited. Drivers stepped out into cool air, checked messages, stretched, or simply stood beneath dim lights watching electrons flow invisibly into their vehicles. There was no smell of fuel, no mechanical clatter, no rush to leave. Charging reframed travel. It encouraged rest rather than endurance. As Model S ownership spread, the effect on night driving became cumulative. Streets grew quieter not because gasoline cars vanished, but because electric ones filled the gaps between them. Intersections softened. Neighborhoods slept more easily. The absence of idling engines altered the texture of urban nights in ways that were felt long before they were articulated. Drivers noticed changes in themselves as well. Long drives were less tiring. Conversations felt easier without constant background noise. Music sounded clearer, unchallenged by mechanical interference. Some described a sense of detachment from stress, as though the car absorbed a portion of it simply by refusing to amplify it. Performance, paradoxically, did not suffer. The Model S was fast, faster than many sports cars that relied on noise and spectacle to convey speed. Electric torque made passing effortless, merging smooth, acceleration decisive. Yet because the car did not dramatize its power, speed felt less aggressive. It did not provoke, it complied. This changed behavior. Drivers did not feel compelled to prove anything. They drove confidently, calmly, aware that capability was available without needing to be displayed. The automotive industry struggled to respond. Reviews praised the Model S in language that sounded almost surprised. Awards accumulated. Comparisons became awkward. How did one measure refinement against silence? How did one justify mechanical complexity when software achieved the same ends more elegantly? Competitors dismissed Tesla at first, then studied it, then quietly began rethinking their own assumptions. Electric programs accelerated. Design philosophies shifted. The idea that software could define the driving experience gained legitimacy. But the most important shift happened away from press releases and boardrooms. It happened on the roads themselves. By the mid-2010s, it was no longer unusual to see a Model S gliding through city streets long after midnight, its headlights reflecting softly off storefront windows. Its presence felt more than heard. It moved with a confidence that did not demand attention. It belonged. The luxury sedan had not been replaced by something louder or more aggressive. It had been replaced by something calmer. The night roads responded accordingly. Silence was no longer experimental. It was credible, reliable, desirable. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Chapter 3: The Silent Infrastructure. Long before electric cars became familiar shapes gliding through city streets at night, before their headlights traced clean white arcs across asphalt and rain, the quiet work had already begun. It was not glamorous work. It did not announce itself with product launches or viral videos. It happened in zoning meetings, in utility boardrooms, in engineering labs humming with fluorescent light, and in the slow recalibration of an electrical grid built for a different century. This was the chapter of cables and currents, of transformers and substations, of invisible systems adapting themselves to a future they had not been designed to serve. It was the chapter most drivers would never think about, even as they relied on it every night. Electric cars, for all their sleekness, were never just machines. They were demands placed upon infrastructure, questions asked of cities, and negotiations with physics. A gasoline car arrived in the world as a finished creature, carrying its energy source within itself. An electric car arrived as a relationship. It required connection. It asked where it would sleep, where it would feed, and how often. It turned parking spaces into endpoints and garages into power stations. It asked buildings to become participants rather than backdrops. At first, this relationship felt fragile. Early adopters memorized the locations of the few public chargers available to them, like sailors memorizing harbors along a dangerous coast. Range anxiety was not a technical problem so much as a psychological one, born from the mismatch between possibility and certainty. The battery could carry you far enough, engineers said, but the world beyond the battery felt unreliable. Gas stations were everywhere, their lights bright and familiar, their pumps standardized by decades of repetition. Chargers were rare, slow, and inconsistent, each one a small experiment in a larger transition that had not yet settled into rhythm. Tesla understood this anxiety instinctively, perhaps because it was not a car company in the traditional sense. It did not inherit the assumptions of internal combustion. It approached transportation as a systems problem rather than a mechanical one. From the beginning, it treated charging not as a peripheral concern but as a core feature, as essential as acceleration or safety. The supercharger network was born not from regulatory pressure or public funding but from necessity. If the cars were to succeed, the world around them had to change, and Tesla chose not to wait for that change to happen on its own. The early superchargers appeared along highways like quiet promises. They were clean, minimalist structures, often white and red, standing slightly apart from the chaos of rest stops and gas stations. They did not smell of fuel or echo with the clatter of engines. They offered electricity at a pace that, while still slower than a gasoline fill-up, felt purposeful. They suggested a new rhythm of travel, one that included pauses not as inconveniences but as moments of rest. Drivers learned to stretch, to eat, to check messages, to sleep. Travel slowed, but it also softened. Behind these stations lay a web of negotiations. Land had to be leased. Utilities had to approve connections. Transformers had to be upgraded. In some cases, entire substations had to be reinforced to handle the sudden demand of multiple vehicles charging simultaneously. Electricity, unlike gasoline, cannot be stockpiled easily at the point of use. It must be delivered in real time, balanced across a grid that responds dynamically to load. Each supercharger installation was therefore an exercise in coordination, a small but meaningful test of whether the existing grid could flex without breaking. In cities, the challenge took a different shape. Urban dwellers did not always have garages. Many parked on the street, their cars lining curbs like sleeping animals. For them, home charging was not guaranteed. Municipalities experimented with curbside chargers, some integrated into streetlights, others mounted on poles or embedded in sidewalks. These were not elegant solutions, but they were necessary ones. They represented the first attempts to reconcile dense urban life with a vehicle that preferred predictability and access. Apartment buildings, once passive containers for human activity, became active participants in energy planning. Property managers debated whether installing chargers would attract tenants or complicate insurance policies. Electrical panels designed decades earlier strained under new loads. Retrofitting became a business unto itself, as electricians learned to thread new capacity through old walls. Every building that added charging infrastructure became a microcosm of the larger transition, a place where the future pressed gently but persistently against the past. Utilities, too, were forced to evolve. For most of their history, electric grids had been designed around predictable patterns. Power surged in the morning as people woke, dipped during the day, and rose again in the evening as lights and appliances turned on. Electric vehicles introduced a new variable. Charging often happened at night when grids were underutilized, which in theory made them ideal loads. But unmanaged charging could also create spikes, overwhelming local circuits and transformers. The solution was not merely more power, but smarter power. Time-of-use pricing emerged as a subtle but powerful tool. By making electricity cheaper at certain hours, utilities nudged drivers toward behavior that benefited the grid as a whole. Cars became participants in demand response systems, their charging schedules adjusting automatically based on price signals and grid conditions. In some regions, electric vehicles began to act as buffers rather than burdens, absorbing excess renewable energy generated by wind at night or solar during midday. The car was no longer just a consumer of electricity, it was part of the grid's choreography. Tesla leaned heavily into this vision. Its vehicles were designed not only to charge efficiently, but to communicate. Software updates refined charging curves, optimizing how power flowed into batteries to balance speed, longevity, and grid impact. Energy storage products like Powerwall and Megapack extended the company's reach beyond transportation, weaving vehicles into a broader ecosystem of generation, storage, and consumption. The night roads were no longer just paths of travel. They were arteries in an electrical system that pulsed quietly with data and intent. The public rarely noticed these changes directly. They experienced them indirectly, through convenience and absence. The absence of waiting in line at a gas station at midnight. The absence of the smell of fuel on their hands. The absence of engine noise echoing through sleeping neighborhoods. These absences accumulated into a new normal, one that felt cleaner and calmer, without ever announcing itself as revolutionary. As infrastructure matured, anxiety softened into trust. Drivers stopped planning every trip around charging locations. They assumed correctly that chargers would be available, that software would guide them, that the system would work. This trust was perhaps the most important achievement of all. Technology succeeds not when it impresses, but when it disappears into routine. Electric charging began to feel inevitable, like Wi-Fi or running water, something you expected to be there without thinking too much about how it arrived. Still, the transition was uneven. Rural areas lagged behind cities. Developing regions faced different constraints altogether. Grid capacity varied widely, as did regulatory frameworks and economic incentives. In some places, fossil fuel interests resisted change, arguing for the stability of familiar systems. In others, environmental urgency accelerated adoption beyond what infrastructure could comfortably support. The result was a patchwork world, where electric vehicles felt effortless in some contexts and challenging in others. Yet even this unevenness told a story of progress. Each new charger installed, each grid upgrade completed, each policy revised to accommodate electric transportation represented a small victory over inertia. Infrastructure is slow by nature, but once it moves, it reshapes landscapes for generations. Roads built for horse-drawn carriages had once adapted to automobiles. Now, those same roads were quietly adapting again, this time to vehicles that moved with the softness of electricity rather than the violence of combustion. At night, this transformation was most visible in its restraint. Cities that once roared after dark began to hum instead. The sounds that dominated were tires on pavement, wind against glass, the distant whine of a motor accelerating gently. Charging stations glowed softly, their lights steady and calm, inviting rather than demanding. The night roads felt different not because something had been added, but because something had been removed. This was the paradox of the electric transition. Its most profound impacts were negative spaces, things taken away rather than introduced. Less noise, less heat, less smell, less friction. Infrastructure receded into the background, doing its work without spectacle. The grid adjusted. Buildings adapted. streets learned new habits, and drivers, without ever needing to understand the full complexity of what supported them, simply drove. Chapter 3 ends not with a climax but with a settling. The silent infrastructure does not announce itself. It holds, it supports, it waits, and in doing so it makes the quiet rise of electric vehicles not only possible but sustainable. The night roads, now threaded with invisible currents and careful planning, carry their travelers forward, guided by systems designed to be felt only in their absence. Chapter 4 Before the Silence, the Spark. Long before electric cars learned to move quietly through the night, before charging stations glowed softly beside highways and parking garages, electricity itself was once the loudest promise of motion the world had known. The idea of moving people without fire, without smoke, without the violence of internal combustion, did not begin in the late 20th century or with Silicon Valley ambition. It began in an age of brass instruments and telegram wires, when electricity was still a marvel and motion itself felt magical. In the early 19th century, when cities were dense with horse-drawn traffic and the air was thick with manure and disease, inventors across Europe and North America experimented with electric propulsion. These early vehicles were crude by modern standards, built from wooden frames and powered by heavy, inefficient batteries, but they possessed qualities that set them apart. They were clean, they were quiet, they were easy to operate. At a time when gasoline engines were loud, unreliable, and physically demanding to start, electric vehicles offered a gentler alternative. By the late 1800s, electric cars were not curiosities, they were contenders. In the United States, companies like Baker Electric, Detroit Electric, and Columbia produced vehicles that appealed especially to urban drivers and women, who were often excluded from the mechanical labor required to operate gasoline cars. Electric vehicles did not need hand cranks. They did not require gear shifting. They did not belch smoke or leak oil onto dresses and gloves. They were, in many ways, more civilized. At the turn of the 20th century, the race between propulsion systems was still open. Steam, gasoline, and electricity competed for dominance. In 1900, a significant percentage of cars on American roads were electric. In New York City, electric taxis operated quietly among the noise of horse hooves and early engines. Charging infrastructure, though primitive, existed in garages and depots. Electricity was local, often generated nearby, and urban distances were short. For a brief moment, the future could have gone either way. What tipped the balance was not superiority of concept, but convergence of circumstances. Gasoline became cheap and abundant. Henry Ford's assembly line dramatically reduced the cost of internal combustion vehicles, making them accessible to a growing middle class. The invention of the electric starter motor eliminated the danger and inconvenience of hand cranking. At the same time, rural electrification lagged behind road expansion, making gasoline a more practical choice for long-distance travel. Electric vehicles, once elegant solutions for city life, began to feel constrained. By the 1920s, electric cars had largely faded from public view. They did not vanish entirely, but they retreated into niches: delivery vehicles, forklifts, industrial equipment. The dream of clean, quiet personal transportation went dormant, not dead, waiting for technology and society to realign. That realignment took decades. Throughout the mid-20th century, gasoline engines improved relentlessly, power increased, reliability improved, infrastructure expanded. The world rebuilt itself around the assumption of combustion, threading highways across continents and anchoring economies to oil. Electricity, though essential, remained largely stationary, tied to homes and factories rather than vehicles. The separation between motion and current became normalized, unquestioned. Yet beneath this dominance, the idea of electric mobility never fully disappeared. In times of crisis, it resurfaced. During World War II, fuel shortages led to renewed interest in alternative propulsion. In the 1970s, oil embargoes and environmental awareness sparked new experiments. American companies, including General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, explored electric prototypes, though most were limited by battery technology that could not meet consumer expectations. Across the Pacific, Japan approached the problem differently. Scarcity of domestic fossil fuels had long shaped its industrial strategy. Companies like Toyota, Nissan, and Honda invested early in efficiency, compact design, and hybrid systems. The hybrid, particularly Toyota's Prius, introduced in the late 1990s, represented a philosophical compromise. It did not abandon gasoline entirely, but it reduced dependence on it. It familiarized consumers with electric motors and regenerative braking. It reframed efficiency as virtue rather than sacrifice. In China, the trajectory was more abrupt. Rapid urbanization, severe air pollution, and centralized policymaking created conditions for accelerated change. The Chinese government identified electric vehicles as a strategic industry, one that could reduce oil imports and position the nation as a technological leader. Subsidies, mandates, and massive infrastructure investments followed. Companies like BYD, originally a battery manufacturer, expanded into vehicles with a focus on electrification from the ground up. Cities became laboratories, deploying electric buses and taxis at scale long before many Western nations considered such moves feasible. South Korea contributed its own quiet momentum. Hyundai and Kia invested steadily in electrification, blending manufacturing discipline with long-term planning. Their early electric models were not designed to dazzle, but to integrate smoothly into existing product lines. This approach, conservative on the surface, built capacity and expertise that would later allow rapid scaling when global demand shifted. Europe, too, played a foundational role. Strict emissions regulations and dense urban centers made electrification not just desirable but necessary. Companies like Renault and BMW experimented with electric models tailored to city life. Governments invested in charging infrastructure as part of broader climate commitments. The European approach emphasized integration, electric vehicles as components of multimodal transportation systems rather than standalone symbols of innovation. By the time Tesla emerged, the groundwork had already been laid by a century of experimentation, failure, and incremental progress. Batteries had improved dramatically, driven by consumer electronics and global supply chains. Power electronics had matured. Software had become central to product design. The idea of electrification was no longer radical, it was waiting for coherence. Tesla's contribution was not the invention of the electric car, but the synthesis of technologies, histories, and ambitions into a single, compelling narrative. It treated the electric vehicle not as an alternative, but as the inevitable successor. This confidence resonated precisely because it stood on foundations built by others, by forgotten inventors of the 19th century, by cautious engineers of the 20th, and by governments and companies across Asia and Europe who had invested patiently in the margins. The night roads, then, are not solely Tesla's creation. They are the inheritance of a long, uneven journey. Each quiet car passing under streetlights carries with it layers of history, from early city electrics to hybrid compromises, from government mandates to private risk. The silence is cumulative, built from countless decisions made across continents and decades. In recognizing this lineage, the rise of electric vehicles becomes less a disruption and more a return. A return to an idea that once seemed obvious. That movement need not be loud, dirty, or violent. That technology could serve without shouting. That progress could arrive not as a roar, but as a hum. Chapter 4 settles into this understanding, placing the present within a broader arc. The electric night is not new. It is remembered. And this memory, now supported by modern infrastructure and global collaboration, finally has the strength to endure. Chapter 5. The night roads belong to electricity. The night roads no longer belonged solely to the gasoline engine. They belonged to those who had learned to move quietly, to those who understood that power could be present without announcing itself, that speed could arrive without spectacle, that motion could be refined into something almost meditative. By the time the mid-2020s arrived, the transformation was so complete that it was difficult to remember when the world had been different. The hum of an electric motor had become a familiar sound, or more accurately, a familiar absence of sound, echoing softly through urban streets, suburban thoroughfares, and winding country roads alike. What had begun as a fragile experiment in Silicon Valley had become a global phenomenon, supported by a century of progress, setbacks, and reinvention. Tesla had led the way, not by creating electricity or inventing the wheel of the modern EV, but by synthesizing technology into a vehicle that demanded to be noticed, if not for noise, then for elegance, performance, and promise. The Model S, the Model 3, the Model X, and later models had not only proven that electric cars could compete, they proved they could dominate. Yet Tesla was not alone. BYD in China, Hyundai and Kia in South Korea, Nissan in Japan, BMW and Renault in Europe, and a handful of experimental startups across the globe had built the scaffolding for a future that now appeared inevitable. Together, these companies had turned electric vehicles from curiosities into norms, from experiments into expectations, from ideas into infrastructure. And the world had adapted accordingly. Charging stations, once scarce and provisional, now glittered along highways like constellations, their lights reflecting softly in puddles of rain. Cities redesigned curbs and parking lots, integrating chargers seamlessly into the urban fabric. Utility companies learned to predict and manage demand with unprecedented precision, and software orchestrated the flow of electrons into vehicle batteries with a subtlety that made the process almost invisible. In this quiet revolution, infrastructure had become as elegant and understated as the vehicles it supported. Progress existed not in spectacle, but in systems humming efficiently in the background, in the spaces where drivers did not have to think about the energy their cars consumed. The night itself had changed. In neighborhoods that once throbbed with the rumble of idling engines, only a whisper remained. Children slept more soundly, adults felt less aggression during late commutes, and the world seemed just slightly smaller, calmer, more introspective. The absence of noise was not emptiness, it was clarity. The road became a companion, not an opponent. Curves were more visible, corners approached more consciously, and the act of driving shifted from mechanical wrestling to mindful motion. In this way, the electric car had accomplished something rarely achieved by human invention. It had altered not only technology but consciousness, the way people perceived movement, time, and space after dark. Cultural shifts followed naturally. Silence became desirable. Owning an electric car came to signal not only environmental awareness, but an appreciation for the subtleties of modern engineering. Media outlets celebrated efficiency and design alongside speed and acceleration. Car enthusiasts learned to appreciate the unique characteristics of electric propulsion. The instantaneous torque, the precise handling, the regenerative braking that felt almost magical, as if the road itself were pushing back gently against momentum. Drivers came to revel not in the roar of an engine, but in the immediate, tactile feedback of a system perfectly calibrated to their intent. Global trends reinforced the momentum. Governments offered incentives, raised emission standards, and implemented low-emission zones that made gasoline engines inconvenient or expensive. Oil dependency gradually weakened, and energy grids shifted to accommodate growing renewable power sources. Batteries improved dramatically, with energy density rising, weight falling, and costs plummeting. Each incremental advance strengthened the foundation, making electric vehicles not just viable but preferable, even for long journeys once dominated by fossil fuel power. For Tesla, the narrative of night roads moving towards silence became entwined with corporate mythology. Elon Musk, often a polarizing figure, was less relevant than the broader vision he championed. Cars designed around energy, software, and experience rather than legacy mechanics. Yet it was also true that other actors shaped the same story. Bide's buses quietly transformed Chinese cities. Hyundai and Kia built reliability and scale. Nissan fostered affordability and accessibility. And European automakers learned to integrate energy systems seamlessly into urban life. Tesla had started the fire, but the night was now shared by the world. And with this shared infrastructure came a subtle shift in collective perception. Motion itself became less about conquest and more about flow. Acceleration no longer provoked, it responded. The sensation of speed was individualized rather than performative. Travelers experienced a sense of control divorced from noise and aggression. Long stretches of highway became contemplative passages rather than endurance tests. A drive through a quiet city after midnight could feel like a meditation, the streetlights gliding past in a rhythmic dance, the world reduced to the motion of a vehicle and the consciousness of its occupant. The psychological effect was profound. Humans, long accustomed to a mechanical environment saturated with noise, began to recalibrate expectations. Quiet became a luxury once again, but one that was widely attainable rather than restricted to the wealthy or the elite. The absence of sound allowed for reflection, for awareness, for noticing subtleties that had long been drowned beneath the engine's roar. It was an intimacy with movement, with space, with night itself. People began to experience roads not as obstacles, but as companions, the journey as meaningful as the destination. By the end of the decade, the night roads belonged fully to electric vehicles. Gasoline engines still existed, but they were marginal, often nostalgic, and increasingly rare in urban centers. The transition had not been sudden, nor had it been violent. It had been cumulative, built upon decades of experimentation, failure, and incremental progress across continents. It was not just Tesla's victory. It was the culmination of a global effort to reimagine the relationship between energy, motion, and human experience. The quiet rise of electric vehicles was, in the end, both literal and symbolic. Roads at night, once defined by noise, had been reclaimed by silence. Infrastructure, batteries, and software had converged to create a system where motion no longer demanded spectacle. Drivers moved with intention, cities breathed easier, and the environment, though still in need of care, gained reprieve from centuries of combustion. The night, once filled with engines and fury, had become a place of calm and possibility. And as the world continued to evolve, the night roads continued to carry travelers forward, not as a destination, not as a performance, but as a promise realized. Electricity had returned to motion not as an experiment, but as the natural state of travel. The road, illuminated by streetlights and headlights alike, reflected softly on the quiet, confident lines of vehicles gliding through the dark. It had become ordinary to witness, yet extraordinary in effect. In every hum, every pause, every perfectly executed turn, the night whispered a truth that had taken more than a century to fully emerge. Motion could be silent, motion could be elegant, motion could belong entirely to the night. And with that quiet dominance, the age of electric vehicles was no longer the future. It was the present. It was here. The world had learned at last to travel without demanding the night to roar.